So as I said, there's this focus on successful aging. People are beginning to do more research, and the aging well, successful aging literature and research is beginning to look at older adults in a different kind of way, instead of saying, well, what's the decline about? What are the big problems that we're going to face in the future? Beginning to look at what interventions can we begin to develop around physical strength and well-being, emotional support to prevent depression, isolation. What can we do to also provide cognitive pieces? We do know that as a population ages, the incidence of Alzheimer's is going to increase quite a bit. So people are now beginning to say, what can we do more proactively from a diagnostic and intervention perspective? So there is literature that supports that older adults still are able to learn. They may learn differently in a different capacity, but that really counters some of our earlier thought about, well, they're old and they need to retire now because they can't learn new jobs and new skills. That's not true. And unfortunately, because of some of the economic situations in this country, many adults at 65 are going to continue to work for much longer, so we know that. So the good news is that in jobs they have, they may shift a little bit in some sort of ways, but there's a tremendous capacity to continue to work, and there's an intellectual and cognitive capacity to do so. From a physical perspective, we're beginning to realize that at any point we can engage people in physical activity, even if they've never been an exerciser, there's still benefit. Typically what happens for any of us is naturally we become more sedentary. We might have been a good exerciser or more active at earlier stages, and we do less. We might have more aches and pains here or there. But if we engage older adults in some minimal but consistent exercise, that there is some increase in strength and endurance, an overall increase in physical health. But we also know along with exercise, we increase the endorphins, and so it can mitigate any forms of depression. For instance, at some senior centers, they have some evidence-based exercise programs and wellness programs in place. And again, this whole notion is shifting. It's like, well, it's old age, there's nothing we can do about it, to just because you're getting older doesn't mean that you can't continue to do the kinds of things that you've always done. And again, I think demographically, this population that's aging into the baby boom, the 65 and older, is a population that has been generally more proactive anyway, and do some things. But regardless of whether the person does or not, it's okay to engage them. Now, what we know about exercise is that people need social support. And when we talk about social support, that's a very broad concept. Usually we kind of think of like, is that a telephone call or being a friend? Well, that's a form of social support, but there's also formal social support. Dr. Resnick on campus here has done some work with folks post hip fracture, and they've provided some interventions where they start off with an exercise program, an exercise physiologist to go in and help them set up an exercise program. They maintain some face-to-face contact and then some telephone contact, and they found that people maintained that level of activity, and that there was greater return to function than if they didn't receive it. And for folks who have falls and fractures, that becomes really critical. We can mend the hip, but there's a real strong need to continue to do some things around regaining some of the function. In some of the studies, they've actually found that some of the function has improved over the fracture. So again, recognizing that just because somebody's old or somebody's had a broken bone doesn't mean that they're unable to engage in physical activity, and that with some social supports they won't do that. And again, the good news is social support makes a difference, but yet with anything else, any kind of behavior, for it to be in place for long term, it does require ongoing social support. Anybody an exerciser, runner, really? Yeah. Do you do that by yourself or with others or both? I mean, I've heard, I'm not a runner. I'm not going to be a runner. I will do other exercise. But I've heard people who do that and have a routine say that the thing that made a difference for them is they found a partner. And the day they didn't want to do it, they knew their partner was going to be there, so they went. I mean, so again, it's motivation, et cetera. We're social creatures, and doing those kinds of things becomes really important. So social support is really, really important. So receiving it and also providing it is important for older adults. One of my study participants was living in what we call assisted living. He needed some help and assistance, but could function fairly independent, had some slight cognitive problems. But he volunteered for an agency and called older adults who were shut in their homes. And he said, he said, I worked all my life. He said, I was a salesman. It was about me and my job. I never gave back to anybody. He said, it's time for me to do that now. And so again, recognize that engaging people in meaningful activities is important. So that's the other side of this aging well notion, is that we need to look at how we engage people. Again, our notion of retirement is, well, you're 65 now, go home and rest. And like I said, for a period, people did that. But I think before people, in terms of researchers that have figured out that may not be the best thing, those people who were retiring said, that's not my idea of retirement. The things I want to do, travel, I have this craft thing I want to develop into maybe a side business, or I'm going to do X, Y, Z. So people have a lot of engagement. And again, there's research now that's beginning to demonstrate the positive physical, psychological, and social impact of engagement kind of activities. And the program that you're working in is an example of how we keep adults 55 and older engaged. And I'm not sure, is your population of 55 and older low income? Does it matter?
It's second year professionals, so it could be, it depends on the skill set that the nonprofit needs.
Okay. And that's, I want to come back to that one.
My hope is
okay.
that it will serve low income.
Okay, because there have been some federal programs over the years that were particularly directed to low-income folks, and so they might work and get some minimum wage, and the income was important to them. It helped them in terms of their sense of, doing their part. I mean, people do want to work for an income, but we also find that in those situations there's a lot of social, emotional, and physical benefits as well. And part of what you're talking about is what we call encore careers or second careers for folks. Again, and reach a point where they can retire and have some financial means, but they want to continue to participate or contribute in the greater good of society. There is another program, and I want to say it's through AmeriCorps, where they're doing some Experience Corps, where they're doing some mentoring with kids in schools. It's a big program in Baltimore City schools. And again, scientifically we measure the health and well-being of the older adult and the kids. We're finding the older adults are healthier, physically healthier, psychologically, socially healthier as we contribute to those things. And so again, what I see as a positive is our view of aging and older adults is beginning to shift. And again, it's not that we just give them anything to do to keep them busy, but people want to find things that are meaningful for them. And in this retirement sort of phase in life, they're beginning to do that. And I have a couple of sisters that are older than I am, and they haven't retired yet, but their plan is to move away from that full-time job, but continue to work in some capacity where their responsibilities are different. So again, I think we're going to see more and more of that. And part of that is driven by some sort of economic pieces. But part of it is, again, this notion of people want to be engaged and have things to contribute in many ways. And there might just be some individual sort of pursuits. Like I said, they may choose to volunteer at a museum as a docent because they love Maryland history. I was on a flight not long ago, and this woman, that's all she does. She retired, and she just loves her docent job and knows Maryland history backward and forward. And so again, that kind of engagement is important, in terms of the socialization opportunities, teaching others who come into the museum, but also sort of her mental sort of space run, being cognitively sharp. Actually, Dr. Amy Cohen-Callow at our school has been working with folks in Maryland, Department of Aging and some others, around some of these initiatives around civic engagement, and that's usually the language we see. Now, one of the things around the language of successful aging, or what's also called civic engagement or productive aging, is I always want to be really cautious because I don't want it to be a notion of you're only worthwhile to society if you're giving back. Now, that isn't to say that those things that people do aren't valuable, but maybe the grandma who stays at home and is there to be a support maybe to the neighbors or her spouse or something like that. Those are important sort of pieces. We don't have to have all older adults volunteering or working some sort of stuff. People need to find that space that works for them. And again, I think in terms of how we view aging, it's really important to think about people as able, capable, willing, despite age. And in as much as they can. Again, when I did my study, there was one guy who was in his 80s, and he finally retired. This was in Kansas, in a little rural town, and he'd been the mayor. And his job was to fire up some sort of water pump system twice a day. And then there was another woman who was the controller or the accountant. And they sort of ran this little burg in south central Kansas. And he said he eventually retired. He said, now she needed to retire. He said she was having some memory problems. He said, so we both retired together. But his retirement was in his 80s, So like I said, I mean, we have those people that have been sort of pushing that window along. What was interesting about interviewing this man was I kept saying, because he was about 85, I said, how old are you? Because I mean, I kept looking at him and talking to him. I'm thinking, this doesn't feel like 85. I mean, I've met people 65 who felt like 85, and I've met 85-year-olds who felt like 65-year-olds, if you know what I mean. So again, that whatever we can do to help preserve that sort of vitality that's in there is really important.